from Ishmael Blasco on the pattern of the New World Order, the Bahá'í administrative order, and Shoghi Effendi's contribution to globalization theory. Brief bio on Blasco is he's a research fellow in sustainable development at the University of Brighton and co-editor of the Bahá'í Studies Review, as well as 20 years in Bahá'í scholarship. So without further ado.
Hello. I don't know whether people have still the stamina. I think there's been sort of non-stop sessions, one after another. So I was explaining to some friends that one of the big challenges for Bahá'í events is to be able to get people to leave the room afterwards. So they scheduled me at the end of the program to ensure everybody would leave. So if you know me, you're not here, and if you don't know me, you'll soon leave. Okay, so I'd like to begin by thinking about this concept of the administrative order. We are here to commemorate and remember Shoghi Effendi and his legacy. And while undoubtedly the framework for the administrative order of the faith was founded by Baha'u'llah himself, in some ways by the Bab himself, followed by Baha'u'llah and by Abdul Baha, really, I think it would be fair to say that until Shoghi Effendi, nobody knew this was the case. Nobody actually knew there was such a thing as an administrative order. They knew there were institutions, organization for the community, like any community needs organization. But from there to extrapolate onto the notion of an order, and let alone to connect it to global events and global processes, that was something that was very, very far from the awareness of most Baha'is before the time of Shoghi Effendi. There is a case in point that I won't dwell, I studied it for a while, about the concept of the order of Baha'u'llah, the Nazm Baha'u'llah, and how this Shoghi Effendi said that this order, this world order, you all know the passage from the Kitab-e-Aqdas, the paragraph 181, where Baha'u'llah says that the order of the world has been revolutionized by the vibrating influence of this most great, his new world order. And Shoghi Effendi linked that passage, like many had before, to a passage in the Bayan, where the Bab said, happy is he who fixeth his gaze on the order of Baha'u'llah. Tuba liman yansiru ila nazm Baha'u'llah. Now, the interesting thing is that the word nazm, for order, is mostly associated with literary pursuits, particularly at that time. It began to have more political uses later, but really mostly you have prose and you have poetry, and nazm is a form of poetry. It means the stringing together of words. And in fact, the original passage of the Bayan is all about how you compile the Bayan in a specific order. So the Baha'is thought that that passage of the Kitab-e-Aqdas, the words Nazm and Tartib, refer to the order of the Aqdas and to the style of the Aqdas. Mr. Naqshbandi said that it referred to the Shiva, that all the scholars thought that that passage referred to how beautifully Baha'u'llah wrote. And indeed that is one of the meanings, and there is sort of a number of passages that confirm that reading. But it was Shoghi Effendi, the very first, who actually saw in this a reference not to a literary arrangement of the sacred text, but to a political and social order that would bring about a new civilization. Before Shoghi Effendi, this vision was not there at all. The notion of the kingdom of God on earth was largely a diffuse image, a sense of we will all love one another and we will get on well with one another and we will have peace. The idea of a restructuring of the whole of the machinery of society, that the provisions of the Kitab-e-Aqdas and the provisions of the Will and Testament of Abdul Baha actually contained the nucleus, the harbinger and the pattern of a new administrative order, which in turn was incubating a new world order, which would eventually give birth to a world civilization. That was one of the gifts of Shoghi Effendi. In one of the letters on behalf of the Guardian, we read, Baha'u'llah has given us the administrative order, which is the channel through which the spirit and guidance flow to the Baha'is and to mankind. The beloved Guardian spent his entire lifetime unfolding and explaining the pattern, and it is this administrative machinery that we should seek to support and strengthen. The beloved Guardian spent his entire lifetime unfolding and explaining the pattern of the administrative order. So in considering this issue, we really are going into one of the most precious aspects of the Guardian's ministry, one that cost him timeless hours of sleeplessness, of hard work, of angst, of pain, of labor. There is one passage where Shoghi Effendi says that he finds that he needs 8 hours a day to sleep in order to function well. And there are a number of testimonies that say that on average he used to sleep around 4. So this was enormously sacrificial labor, all focused on the birthing of this new world order through the machinery of the administrative order. So let us explore this notion of a pattern then. Shoghi Effendi saw in the administrative institutions of the faith a vehicle for the incarnation of the spirit of Baha'u'llah. The spirit of Baha'u'llah that pervades his laws, the spirit of God, became incarnated in institutions, in an order, and this is what generated that vision, that this evolving order, what Dr. Sayedi was mentioning earlier on about the progressive nature of the world, this living thing that continues to unfold. Likewise, the spirit of the course of Baha'u'llah, emerging out of the world, becomes embodied in the impact in believers' hearts, which then becomes crystallized into ways of collaborating and into patterns of interaction that in turn contain the shape of things to come, the pattern, the way things will look in future in the whole of global society. Now, a pattern does not mean an exact replica. It doesn't mean that the rest of the world will have local and national spiritual assemblies by itself. But if it will reflect that pattern, it means that key elements of the template, of the shape, of the dynamics, of the spirit of Bahá'í administration will somehow be replicated in what Baha'is envisage will eventually become the machinery of global society, of the world order of Baha'u'llah.
Should we just plug it in for a minute?
Sure. And sorry, could you confirm when should I stop? Sure. Around 4 o'clock. Okay. Okay, I will not dwell too much on the history and the evolution of the Baha'i administrative order within the Baha'i community itself. I think we are all more or less familiar with it because we've all been part of it. We are still part of it. We are in the second age of the faith, in the formative age of the faith, whose very purpose is to incarnate the spirit of Baha'u'llah into the administrative order that will gradually evolve into the shell, the nucleus of that world civilization, which is the world order of Baha'u'llah. But what I'm interested here is, how does this happen? How does it happen that this pattern that Baha'u'llah envisaged, that the Bab announced, that Abdul Baha delineated, and Shoghi Effendi crystallized in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, how does this very inward-looking endeavor of ours, of building local spiritual assemblies, national spiritual assemblies, and now evolving to the next stage where we just received a very exciting and very moving and transforming message from the Universal House of Justice, beginning to delineate the orientation of the next 5-year plan. And we see how they revise key concepts, key patterns that are evolving and that are new, that were not part of the pattern of Baha'i life in a systematic way in the time of the Guardian, but which continue to unfold, things like the cluster agencies, things like the dynamics of participation of area teaching committees, of course the institute process itself, the engine of growth, the core activities, all these distillations of learning that took place before and that is taking place right now. So we are still part of generating this pattern, and we are told that this pattern will be the pattern of future civilization. Let us see. Baha'u'llah has not only imbued mankind with a new and regenerating spirit, he has not merely enunciated certain universal principles or propounded a particular philosophy, however potent, sound, and universal these may be. That was our state of consciousness before Shoghi Effendi. We understood the Baha'i faith and the Baha'i community and the revelation of Baha'u'llah as the release of a new and regenerating spirit into the world, in which the enunciation of certain universal principles and a particular philosophy which were sound and potent and universal. It was Shoghi Effendi who said he didn't just do that. He has clearly and specifically laid down a set of laws, established definite institutions, and provided for the essentials of a divine economy. These are destined to be the pattern for future society, a supreme instrument for the establishment of the most great peace, and the one agency for the unification of the world and the proclamation of the reign of righteousness and justice upon the earth. These are destined to be the pattern for future society. So if we try to guess what the world will look like, we can look at the laws, institutions, and the essentials of the divine economy provided by Baha'u'llah, and predict that that is likely to increasingly be reflected in the world at large. Shoghi Effendi writes elsewhere, in Baha'i administration, we know that community life is the pattern and basis of the kingdom, and therefore every individual must share in that life, or the foundation will not be universal, and God's wish of seeing the human race as one soul in one body will not be realized. So here we have two incredible concepts. One is that the kingdom of God on earth, the dream of seers over thousands of years, millennia, is linked to a pattern of community life. That the kingdom of God that Isaiah sang referred to a pattern of community life. And that pattern requires that every individual shares in that life of the community. No one is excluded. This is, the House of Justice wrote about how in some Baha'i communities we were still attached, this was a few years ago, to what they called a congregational pattern. The pattern of a congregation, where a few individuals deemed to be qualified are organizing the affairs of the cause, whilst the majority participate and fit the cause into an agenda driven by very different concerns. They said whatever usefulness that pattern may have had in the past, it does no longer have that value. And they say that the consequence of allowing that pattern to exist in the Baha'i community is that we lose two things: social relevance and spiritual vitality. And vice versa, where every individual is able to participate in the life of this pattern of community, then that is the kingdom of God on earth. So it's an incredible thing when you think how Shoghi Effendi took these ancient prophecies, cloaked in the language of vision and poetry, and was able to behold them in us. Hase mentioned how the early Christians said, "Come and see." And Shoghi Effendi was the first to see in us, in this clay, in this raw material, in these imperfections, the actual fabric and basis of the kingdom of God on earth, embodied in a pattern of community life that is the supreme instrument for the establishment of the most great peace. I'll read one last quote on this. The institutions of the Bahá'í administrative order now being raised in all parts of the world through the endeavors of the believers, and the new message from the House of Justice has dwelt more than perhaps in many, many years, certainly since the new processes, on the evolution and the functioning of the local spiritual assembly in villages and in metropolitan cities. So the institutions of the Bahá'í administrative order now being raised by us in all parts of the world through the endeavor of the believers are the precursor. Precursor means the one that comes before, the announcer, the preparer, the preparer of the ground, the precursor, the nucleus. It means that it's a center around which the organism evolves and out of which life flows. And the pattern of that world order which will, in the course of time, exert its full benevolent influence on all the peoples of the earth. So how does this pattern then crystallize in wider society? Because we do foresee one process that I will very briefly touch on, and that was touched on in the previous talk, the previous to last talk rather, that Baha'is do envisage the Baha'i community becoming more and more relevant, the Baha'i teachings become more and more timely, the general population becoming more and more receptive, till more and more people adopt the faith, until we have a majority of the peoples in one country adopting the faith, and eventually choosing to modify their machinery in light of the Baha'i teachings, and eventually a number of countries attaining this kind of awareness and generating a commonwealth of Baha'i states, and that would be the beginning of the Baha'i Commonwealth and the basis of the future order of Baha'u'llah. So this is, let's say, the inner story. But at the same time, we are seeing that the overall world is, in order to attain that simultaneity, Abdul Baha said that the manifestation of God comes embodying the perfections of the age. So the message of Baha'u'llah reflects the emerging consciousness of the environment in which the revelation appears. So as the consciousness of that environment begins to align more and more closely to the consciousness of the faith, the distance between the two worlds diminishes. The distance that people have to traverse to understand and belong and become participants in the building of the New World Order also diminishes. And so those patterns conjoin. And we have a citation from Shoghi Effendi in the World Order of Baha'u'llah. Few will fail to recognize that the spirit breathed by Baha'u'llah upon the world, and which is manifesting itself with varying degrees of intensity through the efforts consciously displayed by his avowed supporters, and indirectly through certain humanitarian organizations, can never permeate and exercise an abiding influence upon mankind unless and until it incarnates itself in a visible order. But the point I want to emphasize here is that Shoghi Effendi says that the spirit that Baha'u'llah has released into the world is manifesting itself directly through the conscious efforts of the Baha'is, and indirectly through the unconscious efforts of, in this case, humanitarian organizations. Elsewhere, and this was the 1930s, I will suggest that actually that process has expanded dramatically since that time. So marvelous a conception, Shoghi Effendi writes elsewhere, finds its earliest manifestations in the efforts consciously exerted and the modest beginnings already achieved by the declared adherents of the faith of Baha'u'llah. It has its indirect manifestations in the gradual diffusion of the spirit of world solidarity, which is spontaneously arising out of the welfare of a disorganized society. So this is an extraordinary and powerful phrase, that the conception of Baha'u'llah, the conception of the oneness of humanity, the conception of the restructuring of the social machinery of humanity is manifesting itself through the very modest efforts of us, but also indirectly through the spirit of world solidarity, which is spontaneously arising out of the welter of a disorganized society. So society is disorganized. Baha'u'llah said the signs of impending confusion and chaos can be discerned inasmuch as the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective. So the order of the world, the current order, as we also saw in an earlier presentation, is badly ordered. And this creates a welter, a confusion, a chaos. And out of this welter, spontaneously, the earliest manifestations of Baha'u'llah's conception are beginning to emerge. And we, I believe, are uniquely privileged in Baha'i history, because Shoghi Effendi announced that the second Baha'i century would witness the first stirrings of that world order, of these previous generations were deprived. And we can see this in the new direction that the faith has taken. The fact that now we are being called on as one of our very central areas of service to engage in the discourses of society and in social action. This is because this convergence has, I believe, and also the capacity of the Baha'i community has attained a level of maturity that has allowed us to get much, much closer to that. So how does this happen? How does this spontaneous arising of this spirit happen? I think here is where I understand the concept of sustainable development as having a very direct link to the vision of the faith. The concept of sustainability and sustainable development really arises out of the concept of unsustainability. It is actually out of the science of what's not sustainable that we have come to begin to conceptualize what may be sustainable, what may be the ideal scenario, the ideal process, the ideal machinery, the ideal distribution, the ideal spirit, the ideal ethos. What is sustainable and what is unsustainable? To me, this concept recalls Baha'u'llah's repeated warnings to humanity that we are being given respite up to a time. If at that time we do not return, we do not change our ways, a great calamity will afflict us. This is no longer prophecy. This is now hard science. And it is the core message of sustainability. That actually, under current patterns, there is a time scale beyond which the system collapses, beyond which calamity grows and intensifies. We've already entered that stage and we are already seeing enormous disruptions. But most scientists have a consensus that there are a whole range of trends that could potentially spell some catastrophic transformations in the global order unless we grasp the shrinking window of opportunity to make those changes voluntarily and those adjustments. So this prophecy of Baha'u'llah, in a sense, actually foreshadows the concept of sustainability. Except perhaps when we read it before, we would have seen it as a purely supernatural thing. We would have read it and thought somehow, like Baha'u'llah said, if we had wished we would bring the lion of indomitable might to come and scare everybody away and everybody would believe. And I think that's how we mostly understood the calamity. That somehow, at some point, something spooky would happen. But as time goes by, we're seeing that actually this is linked to the Baha'i notion of evolution and of history, and of these twin processes of integration and disintegration. Now, these processes of integration and disintegration likewise are very closely linked to modern conceptions of sustainability. Because the basic models that Baha'u'llah advanced, as expounded by Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi and elaborated on by the Universal House of Justice, is that the oneness of humanity, this stage of maturity, predicates, necessitates, calls for a certain type of ordering, a certain type of pattern, this pattern. It calls for the pattern of the Baha'i administrative order. And unless that pattern is created, then things will not prosper, things will fail, because this is what the system requires. This is what civilization requires now. So therefore, really the Baha'i prescription from sort of Baha'u'llah onwards, but most clearly in the World Order letters of Shoghi Effendi, is that anything short of a machinery similar, akin, that follows the pattern of the administrative order of the Baha'i community is not sustainable in the long run. Anything short of the pattern of those beliefs, of that vision of the Baha'i teachings, of the laws, anything short of that pattern, not that exact replica, but that pattern, will not prove sustainable and therefore will lead to, as the quote I already said, because the order is defective, then confusions and chaos will come. Shoghi Effendi is speaking of, and again this is remarkable, Shoghi Effendi is speaking here of the ravages of World War. And already he is alone probably in identifying that the fundamental causes of the disruptions in the world were not to do with the war. They were to do with this, what today people are calling sustainability and unsustainability. Shoghi Effendi says, it would be idle, however, to contend that the war, with all the losses it involved, the passions it aroused and the grievances it left behind, has solely been responsible for the unprecedented confusion into which almost every section of the civilized world is plunged at present. Is it not a fact? And this is the central idea I desire to emphasize, that the fundamental cause of this world unrest is attributable not so much to the consequences of what must sooner or later come to be regarded as a transitory dislocation in the affairs of a continually changing world. So it is not to do that all this global unrest is not to do with a huge war that in history will eventually be seen as just one big blip, as it were, one big dislocation, one big sad chapter in humanity that continues. We're already there, I believe. But rather to the failure of those into whose hands the immediate destinies of the peoples and nations have been committed to adjust their systems of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a fast evolving age. So the cause of global unrest is the failure to adjust, to tweak, to change the economic and political systems in accordance to the needs. Are not these intermittent crises that convulse present-day society due primarily to the lamentable inability of the world's recognized leaders to read aright the signs of the times and rid themselves once and for all of their preconceived ideas, and to reshape the machinery of their respective governments according to those standards that are implicit in Baha'u'llah's supreme declaration of the oneness of mankind? So, Shoghi Effendi is saying that the chief source of unrest is that unsustainability. Now, what this is giving rise spontaneously is as, and this I think has taken, it wasn't so clear at the time of Shoghi Effendi, now it is really the top of the agenda. We heard of Stiglitz, the Stiglitz report is all about that. Basically, they've looked at all those collapses and said, what do we need to adjust? How do we adjust our societies? And this is happening at all levels, at the global governance level, at the local governance level, at the grassroots community organization level, at the personal and subjective level in schools, in families. There's a whole rethinking of what does it mean to work in this way. The Baha'i International Community summarizes this process of structural reorganization on a planetary scale was animated and reinforced by a profound shift of consciousness. Entire populations found themselves abruptly compelled to face the cost of ingrained habits of mind that breed conflict, and to do so in the full glare of worldwide censure of what were once considered acceptable practices and attitudes. The effect was to stimulate revolutionary change in the way people regard one another. So people started seeing the cost. When Shoghi Effendi wrote, people did not see the cost. Now we see the cost. We still haven't adjusted, not by a long shot. Cancun was sort of another Copenhagen in so many ways. We are very far from making the changes that we need to make. But we are certainly we're not in two minds about the costs. We now know what the costs are. And things are changing. Let me try and skip a little bit more. Okay. So let us explore just a few, there are more, many more, but I'd like to highlight some key elements of this pattern. Of the pattern of the administrative order that I suggest is becoming an inherent and undiscovered part of globalization. I will share a little bit more about that. But let us see some of these patterns. So one of them is consultation, obviously. And the basis of this, Baha'u'llah identified. Say, no man can attain his true station except through justice. So God's purpose is to allow us to attain a full station. Dr. Sayed talked about the paradise of each being reaching their potential. And this is not possible in the human world without justice. No power can exist except through unity. This unity paralyzes the collective ability to act. And no welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. Consultation, Shoghi Effendi writes, frank and unfettered, is the bedrock of this unique order. Authority is concentrated in the hands of the elected members of the National Assembly. Power and initiative are primarily vested in the entire body of believers acting through their local representatives. So consultation is the bedrock, the foundation, the place upon which we build. We build on consultation, we build everything else. It is the bedrock. From there, we get all the stuff that becomes institutions. There is a difference made there between authority and power. I won't get into it. Morjan has written very powerfully on that. So one is consultation. Consultation as a bedrock, consultation as a general practice, as an ethos, as a spirit, as an approach. The second thing is structure. It is very unfortunate that some of the believers do not seem to grasp the fact that the administrative order, the local and national assemblies, are the pattern for the future, however inadequate they may sometimes seem. We must obey and support these bodies, for this is the Bahá'í law. Until we learn to do this, we cannot make real progress. So local and national assemblies are the pattern of the future. This is very specific, that our local and national assemblies are part of that pattern. So there is an element of structure, a type of structure. Local and national assemblies are a very specific structure with bylaws and with ways of functioning. Linked to this structure is an ethos of participation. The Article 4 of the local assembly bylaws, which was forged by the American Baha'is under the guidance of Shoghi Effendi, and then under the instruction of Shoghi Effendi, became the template and the pattern for every other local spiritual assembly, states, while retaining the sacred right of final decision in all matters pertaining to the Baha'i community, the spiritual assembly shall ever seek the advice and consultation of all members of the community, keep the community informed of all its affairs, and invite full and free discussion on the part of the community in all matters affecting the faith. Not the all. The all is quite a powerful thing. It will seek advice and consultation of all members of the community. Do we do this systematically? Do we measure what proportion of our community we have actually actively sought to consult with as a local assembly? We keep the community informed of all its affairs and invite full and free discussion in all matters affecting the faith. So there is a culture of a participatory link to these community councils that we have created. And here comes one of the most important aspects, which is probably the key, and it is a balance. There is a great book that I said I would plug, so I will plug it, by our own Dr. Hercock, who said that he would not be here, but sort of came to haggle, harass, thank you, to harass me. So in exchange, I will plug his book. He's written a book about complexity, particular complex systems, how the complex systems, what is the perfect order, so to speak, for global civilization. And there he talks about some of these issues of equilibrium. What is the balance? And this is, I think, crucial. Shoghi Effendi speaks about a balance between the inner expression and the external organization. Should we build up the administrative order to a point of absolute perfection, but at the same time allow it to be hampered or disconnected from the channels within, through which channels the Holy Spirit of the cause pours forth? We would have nothing more than a perfected body out of touch and cut off from the finer promptings of the soul or spirit. If, on the other hand, the influxes and goings forth of the Spirit are scattered, diffused, and subject wholly to the more or less imperfect guidance and interpretations of individual believers, lacking both the wisdom secured through consultation and also the lights of real unity, which shine through consultative action and obedience thereto, a disordered and disorganized activity would be witnessed, which would but dimly reflect the divine purpose of this age, which is no less than the establishment of the reign of divine love, justice, and wisdom in the world. So on the one hand, the flow of the Spirit, the individual expression, and on the other hand, the collective consultative discipline of organization. A balance between unity and diversity. It is not uniformity we should seek in the formation of any national or local assembly, for the bedrock of the Bahá'í administrative order is the principle of unity and diversity. Remember, the bedrock was consultation a second ago. Now the bedrock is unity and diversity. It's a rich bedrock, which has been so strongly and so repeatedly emphasized. Differences which are not fundamental and contrary to the basic teachings of the course should be maintained. Not they're okay, they should be maintained. While the underlying unity of the administrative order should be at any cost preserved and ensured. Balance between unity and diversity. And a wonderful summary in the language of global governance from the Bahá'í international community. This is still Shoghi Effendi. This is a different one. This is the balance between centralization and decentralization. The utmost vigilance, the most strenuous exertion is required by them if they wish to fulfill the functions that is their charge. They should endeavor to maintain the balance in such a manner that the evils of over-centralization, which clog, confuse, and in the long run depreciate the value of Bahá'í service, shall be entirely avoided, and on the other, the perils of utter decentralization, with a consequent lapse of governing authority from the hands of the national representatives of the believers, definitely averted. So, decentralization, over-centralization. The way the Bahá'í international community mentions it, offering it as a pattern for the world, is a balance harmonizing the seemingly paradoxical concepts of globalism and decentralization. Okay, so we have here then certain patterns. A participatory culture that is expanding now. Now we have extended this institutional framework into our patterns of learning, into our patterns of community action, into our patterns of capacity building. We now have these processes of universal participation and of the liberation of each individual's capacity to contribute, also through the institute process, through the that underpins the pedagogy of the Junior Youth Empowerment Program and of the children's classes. So we are seeing now how already the Baha'is are pioneering the correlation of the patterns they found in the Bahá'í administrative order to wider spheres. Now, one of the interesting things is that it's a reciprocal process. We're also learning from the outside world. It was researching this paper, looking at the history of participation. It was interesting that one historian in Canada highlighted the work of Dr. Arbab in Colombia. First of all, as the head of the Rockefeller Foundation and subsequently as founder of Fundaec. So it's already beginning to, the historic significance of this correlation is beginning to come. And I think anyone acquainted with some of the thought of people like Freire, etc., will see many parallels in the thoughts that underpin the evolution of the Ruhi Institute and the tutorial learning system. I think there's been a cross-insemination framed within the spirit of the Bahá'í teachings. Now, I'd like to first map some ways in which this is paralleled outside. Because one of the fascinating things I found is that participatory processes and approaches, ways of organizing governance and community advocated in the world today, that bear substantial resemblances to the shape of Bahá'í administration are growing, are proliferating. More and more systems are being put in place that seem to not necessarily capture the spirit, but certainly evoke the shape or the pattern of Bahá'í administration. And what's fascinating about this is that the people championing it are championing it for opposite purposes, with completely contrary goals, and from opposite ideological camps. So we have on the far right people advocating consultative bodies as a way to get rid of government. On the far left, we have people advocating consultative bodies, community consultative bodies, as a way of empowering the disenfranchised and the poor and giving everybody a voice. In the political center, we have technocrats advocating participatory processes and structures in government. You can see it's all in the news now with sort of involving more and more people in the big society, in Britain, for example. But this is all over the world. I hope I have time to review some of these processes. But in the center, the political center, it is about developing good consumer outcomes, better information. Most of these people hate each other. And most of these people are using these structures to combat one another. But what's fascinating is that they're all having to turn to this. Why? What is it that's making people across all ideology begin to evoke and reflect some of the patterns that Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, and Shoghi Effendi outlined, first of all in the middle of Shia Qajar Persia in the 19th century. How is this happening? And we have, I want to sort of, this is a rising trend. If you look at a timeline at the use of concepts like participation or participatory, you find that it goes like that, like that, like that, and then suddenly in the 60s it starts growing, 2000 it's up to here. And now it's everywhere. You cannot actually get away from the language of participation, involvement, engagement, consultation. It is absolutely everywhere. You have participatory media, participatory medicine, participatory design, participatory governance. You have participatory education. There is, if you just Google participatory, you will find that the vocabulary, and that's just one word, there are obviously many other synonyms that evoke very similar concepts. It's beginning to enter as subjectivities, the way we relate to raising children, the way we relate to going to the doctor, what we expect from our doctors. We expect a consultative process, not a paternalistic one, in more and more places. Now, another of the interesting things here is that, and I don't have much time to go into the social theory of this, but we have processes like the United Nations. This is another, I want to give you a brief survey just to give you a sense of how this is happening everywhere. So, in the United Nations, the concept of the participation of civil society, not just government, of the community, so to speak, was enshrined from the beginning in the Charter as through the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, but not in any other aspect. And even then, there were only 148 NGOs accredited at the beginning. We were one of them. The Baha'is have been very much at the heart of it. And in fact, some of We the People, for example, was a result of civil society participation in the process, the beginning of the United Nations Charter, that sentence. Now, I want to share an idea of the evolution. Okay. Less than 300 NGOs attended the Stockholm Conference on the Environment in 1992. 1,400 NGOs registered with the Rio Conference, and 18,000 NGOs attended the parallel NGO forum. The Baha'is were the only one. Out of 14,000, there were only 12. This was one of the first innovations of participation. Was the first time that NGOs in Rio were allowed to address directly the General Assembly. There is no provision in the United Nations for the General Assembly to engage with NGOs. 1992 was the very first time. So out of the 18,000 who were assembled, there were how many did I say? 1,400 registered, accredited, and out of those 1,400, 12 were allowed to speak. Out of those 12, only one had any religious or spiritual content to them, and that was the Baha'i community. So we've been really at the forefront of this process of expanding participation in the global system. You can see that at women, this is a good one. In 1975 at the Mexico City conference, I had to bring in my country in there, for international women, nearly 6,000 people attended the NGO forum, and 114 NGOs gained access to the official conference. Take it 10 more years, 85, and 13,500 people registered, and many more attended the NGO forum, and 163 NGOs were accredited to the official meetings. 10 years later, in Beijing, over 300,000 people attended the Beijing NGO Forum for Women. 3,000 accredited NGOs, from 140 to 3,000 accredited NGOs. Now, because there were so many at this is another beautiful story. They had again a chance to address the General Assembly. So they had to choose somebody to represent all of them. They voted for the Baha'is. But the Baha'i delegation did something then that made its status grow dramatically in the community, in the international community. They said, we already had a go last time. Let somebody else come. And they ceded their place as representatives to another set of NGOs. And this again, in the millennium, the biggest of all so far, again the Baha'is were elected as joint representatives. But what you can see, above all, is the numbers. This rise in NGO participation. The same has happened with the Security Council, a very hermetic organization. This is the 5 permanent members and others who decide on matters of conflict. Very secretive, extremely politicized. But little by little, since the 90s, the degree of NGO participation has shot through the roof. I'm running out of time, so I won't give you other examples. I was going to give you the example of the International Monetary Fund, and I chose them because they are probably the least participative institution in the world. And yet, the pressure of history has been pushing even them in the direction of participatory structures. Their structural adjustments programs have shifted. They now have poverty reduction programs, etc., that are still subject to enormous critique by the global community, but which nevertheless has a tendency, again, against all expectation, are moving in this direction. Now, I wanted to put people like IMF because I also wanted to share with you about the Zapatistas. These are the Mayans in Mexico who started an uprising in January '94 a kind of revolution in a very local place. But it was very new. It was the first time ever that such a movement had said, our aim is not to take power. Our aim is to create a consultative space. That's what they said. They said, what we want to achieve, our goal is to create, at the moment there is no space for hearing the voices of the marginalized. What we want to do is not for everybody to become a Zapatista or for us to take control over the means of production. No, what we want to do is create a process of consultation on a national scale. And they said that any community that they moved into, they had, so they were an armed movement, but above all they were a community movement, had the right to say, no, please don't interfere with us, and they would leave them alone. These were all very new things, but what was really amazing, I spent some time in those communities 2 years ago, is that they developed an entire system of community development that to me recalls some of the work of the Bahá'ís in Iran. Because the government closed them off to access to education and to health, they developed their own participatory processes of a health system, of an educational system, of an environmental system, all through based around community participation. Community councils that were elected from the community without campaigning, and through consultation all the decisions were made. They had a very different approach insofar as they wanted complete rotation so that everybody would get an experience of governance, which sometimes made it a very inefficient system, but it did mean that everybody participated, and it was very, very powerful. But again, they are completely on the opposite side of, say, the World Bank or the IMF, for them it's the devil, so to speak. But you see this pattern being replicated. A community in Scotland called Western Hales, the second most deprived ward at the time I lived there in Scotland, had the most sophisticated, no longer, but at the time had the most sophisticated community development model in Europe. And they basically had their own community parliament in the neighborhood. They had 19 neighborhood councils, and then those neighborhood councils elected their overall area representative council, and in that council they were all residents, they were all local people, and everybody was eligible. They did have campaigning there, but everybody could be voted in, and they managed an entire system of welfare, of social welfare and community development, all in the hands of the community. Again, a similar pattern. So there are more examples. I could give you examples from the UK government, how we've gone from sort of an expert in 91 saying the notion of partnership working sounds promising, to it being unthinkable to develop any social policy without a multi-agency approach, etc. The Philippines, another sort of example where international support led to the development of local participatory structures. So it's happening everywhere, and nobody knows why. And nobody can see a coherence. When I sat with Dr. Paul Hopper, not a Bahá'í, and said, do you know, he's an expert in globalization, has published 2 volumes on it, he's publishing another 2 now. And I said, I'm hoping to write something here to suggest that the main experts on globalization, although one of the most well-known, are called David Held and McGrew. And they they looked at all the different dimensions of globalization. And they said it's so many ways of talking about it. But there are 5 features that seem to run through everybody. So one way of defining globalization is these 5 features. A growth in economic interconnectedness within and among regions with multifaceted and uneven consequences. 2, interregional and global competition that challenges all hierarchies and generates new inequalities. 3, transnational and transborder problems that call into question the role, functions, and accountability of national government. 4, an expansion of international governance at regional and global level, and an inherent requirement for new modes of thinking about politics, economics, and cultural knowledge, and cultural change. I think under that 5th bracket, what I suggested to Dr. Hopper was that I was considering that participatory, they call it participation mostly, but we would call it consultation. That consultative structures and processes are not an accident, but they are inherent, an inherent part of globalization, that no one has spoken. And I asked him, has anyone said this? And I haven't yet found anyone who has said that this is an inherent part of globalization. And when I said this to him and exposed some of the things I've shared, he said, why didn't I think of it? You've just stumbled on it. I didn't say actually Shoghi Effendi stumbled on it. He didn't stumble on it. He said it was a future. The only way I thought it is because Shoghi Effendi said it's the pattern. And so that is the pattern of things to come. And so I think it's, to me, as time goes by, we can say that Shoghi Effendi's thought around the nature and the evolution and the significance, above all, of the Bahá'í administrative order is likely to change the way we understand the processes of globalization, the way in which society is changing. And finally, that leaves us, I think, with one conclusion, which is the significance of our work within the Bahá'í community. And this is something that again is expanded very much in the very latest message from the Universal House of Justice to the councillors that just arrived in the last 2 or 3 days. The House of Justice writes, the order brought by Baha'u'llah is intended to guide the progress and resolve the problems of society. Our numbers are as yet too small to effect an adequate demonstration of the potentialities inherent in the administrative system we are building. And the efficacy of this system will not be fully appreciated without a vast expansion of our membership. With the prevailing situation in the world, the necessity to effect such a demonstration becomes more compelling. It is all too obvious that even those who rail against the defects of the old order and would even tear it down are themselves bereft of any viable alternative to put in its place. Since the administrative order is designed to be the pattern for future society, the visibility of such a pattern will be a signal of hope to those who despair. This is a task that only we can do. Nobody else can do that task. What is very exciting to people like myself who've been working in the field of social action and social discourse for many, many years is that these worlds are converging and that now the work of the Bahá'í community is directly engaging. We are already beginning to systematically work on making that pattern visible. Making that pattern visible. And the core activities, the way in which our administrative order functions, the efforts that we bring, the way we execute the plans of the Universal House of Justice are the way this pattern becomes visible. And as this pattern becomes visible, it reveals new features, new potentialities that allow the rest of the world likewise to converge and hopefully arrive at. I would like to finish with one caveat in what I have said. And in the interest of time, I won't read the citations. But Shoghi Effendi does make 2 warnings. One is that we should never confuse the Bahá'í administrative order with any other pattern or system that is out there, whether in the past or in the present, he says. And I believe that even now that is the case. In fact, as you go through the literature on these patterns, what I've shared with you is the emergence of that pattern, but that pattern isn't functioning. Most of it is cosmetic. Most of it is actually used for contrary purposes, so for manipulation, for co-option, for disempowerment. They found that this is one way, but the trend, the process itself, is obviously emancipatory. But Shoghi Effendi says that to actually identify, to see too close a resemblance between what we see in these reflections, these indirect early manifestations of the spirit of Baha'u'llah in the world around us, and the system that Baha'u'llah has declared, would be to completely miss the significance of a system that enshrines the world order that will bring about the new civilization of Baha'u'llah. And the second and last caveat that I'd like to share is that Shoghi Effendi does contemplate the possibility of the world outside achieving a pattern that is very, very aligned and close to the faith. But he says the most that can achieve is a lesser peace. So So the lesser peace is, in a sense, the successful patterning of global society after the pattern of the Bahá'í administrative order. That may be one way, this is my words, not the writings, but I think this may be one way of conceptualizing the lesser peace. It's the moment at which society as a whole has successfully patterned itself after the shape, after the pattern of the Bahá'í order, but has not yet acquired or become imbued with its spirit. And it is its spirit, as we read in that quote, it is only when that perfect machinery is imbued by the promptings of within, by the Holy Spirit of the course, that the true unity, which is the kingdom of God on earth, the kingdom of Baha'u'llah, will be realized. With that, I thank you very much.
Before we go to our break, are there any questions?
I don't know if it's a question or a comment or a reflection, but you mentioned the two references in the quotation to the bedrock of the system being, one was consultation and the other being unity and diversity. And I guess my question is, do you see a distinction between those two? Because to me, the essence of consultation is to reach unity through diversity. I don't see how they could be separated, the two.
Beautiful. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful correlation. I think that's true. I think as you look at it, if you put them together, both illuminate the meaning of one another in a very beautiful way. But I don't think we do link them conceptually, but we don't usually see them as so. So to me, that kind of reflection, the one that you've just made, there's a lot of development. I think it is worth, actually, it's the kind of thing that I like to spend a few minutes or a few hours closing my eyes and thinking, how does consultation mean unity and diversity? How does unity and diversity mean consultation? So thank you.
Follow. From my understanding of what you say, therefore, the world will fail in imitating the pattern that the Baha'is have. So then they will ask for a way in which that spirit, which causes the success of that pattern, to happen. When do you think such a occurs, and in what way will it be?
That's okay. I mean, I think that all those questions really are so far into the distance, and we do not have any specific guidance on that, on this will happen by such a date or by such an age. There are, we have a sense of process, we have a sense of what are the stages that are likely to take part, but not a sense of the exact timings. And we do know that we have 1,000 or thousands of years framework. We don't even have a very exact frame for the initiation of the next dispensation. So I don't think we can say sort of specific timing. And likewise, I think in terms of specific patterns, it would probably be premature to try and be too detailed, to say the world will fail or will not fail. I think we'll probably discover, it might be that, you know, when the House of Justice says that peace is not only possible but inevitable, but whether it is to be reached now by an act of consultative will on the part of the world's peoples, or is only to be reached after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, is the choice before all on earth. So this gives us two choices. One choice would be to choose the pattern, and the other choice would be to fail to choose it. At the moment, most predictions and trends suggest that we're failing, as you say, that we're actually failing to choose that pattern on a sufficient scale. But it may be that as time goes by, what we find is more of a convergence, and that it's not so much that people find that they haven't been able to, what they're doing is completely different to what the Baha'is are doing, but more that as they're doing something similar, they can appreciate what is unique about the Baha'is. But it could be the other way around as well. So I don't think we can be so precise as to the shape of things to come. We only have very broad guidance as to what are the stages and the nature of the process, I would say. I have been asked to do a couple of plugs. One is for this from Parvane, who has Paris Talks recorded in English, the whole thing. So apparently you can buy it from there. And I believe you may have, Masood, I don't know, you may have postcards of the Baha'i Studies Review, which is many of you who are involved in Baha'i studies, who are writing, who are thinking about it. This is an invitation, I'm sort of the co-editor of it. It's an invitation for you to consider submitting articles, sharing your thoughts and your